So let's start about setting some expectations about what we're going to talk about over the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. I'm not going to discuss what good automation looks like, although I do have a pretty hard time avoiding my automation soapbox, so beware of that. Nor am I going to talk about agile methodologies. This isn't an Agile 101 course, and probably not qualified to teach that anyway. And it's really not about testing in an agile development environment either. But what it is about is the benefits of taking an agile approach to implementing test automation and the advantages that that offers over more traditional implementation approaches. I'm going to show how automation implementation tasks map into agile processes. And finally, I've sprinkled in some examples of what agile development assets and deliverables look like for automation projects. So just get everyone on the same page. So I think it'll help if I set the context a little bit and give you some background on how we first came about the idea to try to apply agile principles to automated testing implementations. A couple of years ago, we had implemented a successful, or so we thought anyway, implementation of automation for an ERP system for a large enterprise IT organization. And we followed our normal process of gathering the requirements up front. We used our usual framework approach and delivered the end product over 3 or 4 month waterfall style implementation. And we satisfied the requirements on time, within budget, and we threw up our hands in victory. We agreed on a plan and some detailed requirements, ended up with what we thought the customer wanted. However, what they didn't tell us was that the requirements changed a bit over that 3 or 4 months. And that, combined with maybe some less than realistic expectations about what automation really is and what it means, resulted in a pretty big miss in terms of what the customer actually wanted. Now, the fallout wasn't as bad as the slide might lead on, but it certainly prompted us to take a step back and think about past implementations and any issues that we experienced. And what we found was that there were some common issues, and the two most glaring was that we weren't doing a good job of identifying and managing scope change during that implementation. And we had a lack of customer involvement during that implementation. So even though we're a third party coming in and implementing automation, certainly anyone implementing automation has an internal customer. And we found that we had a lack of involvement during our implementations. So we talked about how to address them, and the solutions that were being presented sounded a lot like agile development. Things like frequent custom reviews, active scope management, developing a usable solution from the beginning so the customer could have something to get their hands on and get value from. From there, we took some agile training, very light, self-serve type stuff, and developed our own flavor of agile development. And so we'll talk about what that looks like and some of the lessons learned along the way in the rest of the presentation. So let's talk about some of the benefits that we've realized from applying agile principles. So as we go through the remainder of the topics, we can relate them to one or more of these benefits. One of the biggest positive changes we've seen is stakeholder visibility to what we're doing and positively managing their expectations. It really helps when they see the realities of what automation is and some of the issues that the automation engineers deal with in their day-to-day work. Things like uncontrolled test data and uncommunicated application changes, and the impact that they have on automation. They're much more less likely to have that silver bullet syndrome that comes with test automation, and it's certainly very common, at least in our work. Another is scope management. Agile's frequent planning and feedback loops provides much better communication of the requirements and gets everyone involved in those scope decisions versus the engineers having to make those decisions on their own and then resulting in a surprise somewhere down the road. We've also been able to demonstrate value much sooner. I'm sure many of us have been involved in automation implementations where support has fizzled over time as the stakeholders wait for the finished product. By delivering value early, we can reverse that trend a bit and actually grow support over time. And we do that in pretty obvious ways. We start with automating things like data creation, smoke tests for small areas of the application, etc. Something that can be used and provide a bit of value to the group. And it should be noted that this doesn't happen just because you take an Agile approach. You can have all the sprint planning meetings and reviews that you want, but if the stakeholders aren't participating, then you're not going to realize these benefits. They have to realize that they own this product, just like they own the application that it's testing. It's just as important to understand what an Agile approach to automation implementation won't give you. We're just talking about the development approach. That doesn't magically give you a good strategy for automation, meaning the organization, environment, and other factors that need to be in place for successful automation to happen. It certainly doesn't architect your framework for you so that the solution's reliable, maintainable, and scalable. It doesn't give you good test data management, which we know can be a huge issue and have huge impact to automation. And it doesn't magically integrate automation into the way you develop and test software. So you still need to have good automation practices if you want to succeed. Using Agile is not a free pass to be lazy in those respects. So now that we have a baseline and hopefully a common understanding of where we're going, let's dive in. I want to start the discussion with the role of the automation product owner. The product owner serves as the proxy for the organization that is set to benefit from automation. They own the backlog or the features and the scope of the test automation implementation. And while test automation isn't a product in the exact same sense that the application it tests is, the automation product owner still must understand their business, which is testing in this case, and the specific type of value that automation brings. Very often the product owner, at least in our implementations, is the QA testing manager responsible for the quality of the application under test. Therefore, it's extremely important that the resource filling this role has a realistic understanding of what automation is and the benefits that it can provide. An automation product owner with silver bullet syndrome is not a good recipe for success. With all that said, I feel it's important that the product owner be the same person that will own automation after it's implemented. It's certainly tempting to put an automation architect or an automation lead in that role because they already have that requisite knowledge and realistic expectations. However, that also creates the risk that the very people that need to be involved and understand the realities of test automation will never become invested in the effort. And sometimes there are real availability issues with the product owner, and in that case the test automation lead or architect can serve as a proxy product owner, but they must take on the responsibility of keeping the product owner apprised, and a lot of times that means educated on what's on realities of automation and what's going on with the implementation. I also just want to briefly talk about the role of Scrum Master. In our initial implementations, we didn't have that role, and we felt some pain. Someone that can keep the team honest with respect to Agile processes, and not just turn the implementation into a waterfall implementation that happens to be delivered in small iterations. And typically that the Scrum Master is played by the automation architect or the automation lead, at least again in our implementations. It doesn't have to be though. One of the Agile concepts that we found especially helpful is the use of personas. We use personas to bring the focus of the automation implementation where it should be, on the users of the solution. It also keeps the stakeholders from thinking about scope only in terms of test cases, and we'll talk more about that later. And just as important from a technical perspective, this keeps the automation engineers from taking a very technical, stuck-in-the-trees view of the solution. I've seen a lot of automation implementations that are very technically cool, but are created only from the engineer's perspective and really don't serve the organization appropriately. So personas help us think about how the different roles in the organization will be using the solution and how they'll benefit from it and ensure that they're represented. So from an automation implementation, certainly the actual roles may vary, but typically consist of what I've listed here on the slide. We have an app dev manager or a product owner, and they have input into the testing priorities, and they need insight into the quality of the application. So the automation solution needs to provide that. The QA manager, they need to understand the impact of automation on their resources. They also have input to the content and format of the execution results. How can I determine what just executed? What were the results? The test lead, the engineer, they'll be the main users of the test suite, and they'll be creating test cases, they'll be executing, they'll be evaluating results. Their input and involvement is absolutely essential. The test data owner, with test data, both underlying system data and test data being such an important factor, if that role doesn't exist in the organization, it probably should from an automation perspective. The test environment owner, there's going to be expectations both of the environment owner as well as from them in the form of realities associated with what can be done with the environment. And finally, the automation engineer. And while it might be strange to think of a developer as a user, they do have important input, right? They want to minimize maintenance of this solution. They want to minimize the demand on them during execution and results analysis, right? They don't want to be full-time support engineers every time a test is executed. So thinking of things in that standpoint helps them design and build a better solution. Input to what personas are important in any given organization or any given implementation are going to come from an assessment portion of a test automation strategy. So just understanding how an organization can benefit from automation, what the current roles are, and how they'll have input into that solution. It should be noted that we don't carry the concept of personas to the extreme. If you've been involved in Agile implementation, sometimes you'll see the personas up on a wall, and you've got pictures associated with them and backgrounds and things of that sort. We don't give them names. We don't put their pictures up on a wall. But what we really did was just document the goals of the stakeholders and discuss how they are involved with and can benefit from automation. So when we build our roadmap and our backlog, those perspectives are taken into account, and it's not just what test cases am I going to automate. This slide, at least from an Agile perspective, might seem like the master of the obvious, but I want to go a little bit beyond the planning is a good thing message and do the low effort, high benefit stuff first and talk more about vision. One thing that we found is that automation typically isn't planned in the same way that other products are. And yeah, there may be tasks laid out in some type of order, but that's really putting the cart ahead of the horse. I rarely see people talking about the vision for automation. And if I ask what they hope to achieve with automation, the most common answer is, well, to automatically execute test cases or reduce my test cycle time. Nothing specific about what that means or what the specific benefits might be. And what this leads to is jumping right to release planning with no overarching objective to guide the development of the roadmap and eventually the release and sprint planning. So take the time to think about what you can achieve with automation. It'll make the backlog development, release planning, and sprint planning much more effective and help you come out with a much better implementation in the end. So one of the things that I preach about automation, so I am going to get on my automation soapbox for a second, is not to focus on existing manual test cases when developing automation scope. So in other words, the automation product backlog. Focusing on individual test cases tells you very little about what your solution needs to do, your automation solution, that is. Thinking about individual test cases as the basis for test automation features is kind of like thinking about individual routes that a car might take when you're developing features for a new car model. Would you say, I want the car to be able to drive on Interstate 55 between Chicago and St. Louis? Well, no, of course not. But looking at test cases, individual test cases to tell you what your automation solution is going to do is very similar to that. You want to express your backlog in terms of features and functionality that enable you to automatically execute testing activity that is appropriate for automation. And certainly your test cases are going to provide input into that process. That's what we're here for in the first place. But they shouldn't be the features themselves. As an example, we recently had an implementation project that had about 2,000 regression test cases. The customer's initial objective was simply automate as many of them as possible, with the expectation that at the end some percentage of those 2,000 test cases would be automated exactly as they existed for manual execution. So from the onset we had a challenge to change their view, to think about testing activities, so the application functionality and verifications actions that will be automated. And then we certainly use those test cases to determine what activities and verifications we need to look at, but we automated them and created them as reusable assets that we could use to put all our test cases together that were eventually automated. But we certainly did not begin blindly automating manual test cases verbatim. That is an absolute recipe for disaster. And beyond test cases, the ability, that's not the only type of feature you need to think about. There are features that are there to serve the personas we talked about a few minutes ago. Things like reporting, test case definition, and that's how and where the actual automated test cases are defined. Well, you need to think about parallel execution. Are you going to integrate with continuous integration tools and other similar features? And finally, don't forget about the environment and operational processes that go along with automation. So things like how application changes are communicated to the automation team. How is test data in the automation environment managed? There are a lot of organizational, process, and environment factors that will affect the success of automation. They need to become part of the backlog too. Even though they're often outside the control of the automation team, but you need to think about them so you don't end up with a great technical solution but nowhere to effectively execute it or effectively maintain it. So moving along the implementation path here, we'll talk a little bit about Sprint Zero. And one of the principles we try to adhere to is to deliver value each sprint. And that means that the users are getting value, not just that the automation engineers created some code or some entities, but the users are using what we built to deliver value to the organization. At the beginning, this might be a basic smoke test, it might be data creation for use in other activities, but we have something that's actually being used and delivering some incremental value. Now, we don't have a magic wand that we can wave that allows automation engineers to deliver value on day one. There's some work to be done first, and we do that work in what we call Sprint Zero. At the risk of starting a religious debate of whether or not Sprint Zero is a term that has its place in Agile, simply we use Sprint Zero to prepare to deliver value in the subsequent sprints. That preparation consists of getting the automation environment prepared, getting development machines set up, execution machines set up, standing up a CI server if that's part of what we're thinking about. If we have a base framework that we start with, we're configuring that base framework for use in this specific implementation. We start initial assignment of the automation backlog to sprints. And one thing we do in Sprint Zero that you probably wouldn't do if you're developing an actual product or an application is education of the stakeholders. Ideally, the project stakeholders already understand the realities of automation and come in with realistic expectations. But unfortunately, we find that there are some gaps that need to be filled there. They need to understand what automation is, what the benefits are, what the realities are of creating and maintaining an automation solution. And there are some additional benefits as well. It helps get the team into the habit of the regular stand-ups and serves to educate those on the Agile processes that we're using for those that are new to it. Finally, it's important that you don't turn Sprint Zero into a detailed design session. I don't know if it's simply human nature or something else, but when starting to develop software products, we have this deeply rooted need to see the end product and then construct a detailed plan for getting there. And this is not what Agile is about. When we first started to use Agile for test automation development, this is where we kept getting bogged down. We wanted to see the end product. The customers wanted to see exactly what was going to be delivered and when. And it took a while to get over that, you know, and just make Sprint Zero a situation where it would not just keep getting extended until we had this comfort level of exactly what the end product was going to be. So don't let yourselves get bogged down in that, and you know, use the period of time before you actually start the sprints into kind of a waterfall design session. So I want to talk a little bit about sprint planning, but not in general, but specifically address some automation areas. So remember, a primary source of requirements for test automation are the test requirements of the application under test. And we continually interrogate the team about any known changes that are in development. This includes the product sprint planning meeting, daily stand-up, sprint review meeting. And while one might argue that attending the sprint planning meeting and stand-ups are enough, we found that things still fall through the cracks. And as I mentioned earlier, one of your backlog items should be identifying how application changes are being communicated to the automation team. If that's in place, you don't have to hope that you happen to catch these application changes and these other communication mechanisms like the planning meetings and the stand-ups. So very important to have that communication process in place, and that's true for any type of automation implementation. You don't want to find out that you have application changes that have negatively impacted your automated test suite when you're actually trying to execute it to get test results. So I'll argue that Sprint 1 is the most critical in automation implementations, and that's for many reasons. But one of the most important is the anticipation of that first automated execution. The more time that passes without that proof in the pudding, the more you risk losing support for your efforts. As I said before, we want to add value to the organization every sprint. So for Sprint 1, we're looking for testing activities that cause the organization the most pain. And often that just isn't the execution of a set of test cases. Very often it's responding to frequent requests to create or maintain test data, and maybe those are coming even from outside the testing team. One lesson we've learned is that delivering value every sprint is not easy. 2 or 3 weeks for a sprint isn't a whole lot of time. Early on, we very often fell short of this goal, but looking back, it was typically due to trying to stuff too much work into the sprint, either through poor sprint planning or only adding effort mid-sprint instead of trading new features for existing features that were now lower priority. I'll talk next about minimum viable product and how it relates to delivering consistent value. Building test automation solutions is not a simple process. It involves technical, process, organizational factors coming together in an organized way. And I've been involved in many of these implementations that took the big bang approach and really delivered no value until the project was complete. To use the graphic as an analogy, we would go behind a curtain for some time, 3, 6, maybe 12 months, and then reappear with a car, hoping that the features are still what the customer needed. If you take an Agile approach and focus on delivering value every sprint, you really are taking a minimum viable product approach. And from an automation perspective, this has some important benefits. It gets the organization using the solution, again, even if it's only to create data or to spin up and tear down environments, but it's being used and adding value. And it helps people to visualize the future benefit of automation and gets them involved in the feedback loop, which helps guide future scope and in the end ends up with a better solution. If you take the Big Bang approach, you miss out on a lot of important feedback, at least at a time when you can do something about it. And I think most importantly, you limit yourself to one shot in terms of preserving support for test automation. If you get it right, support continues. If you get it wrong, you're probably done. As we transitioned from waterfall to Agile, we had a project where we did all the work, completed the components, but didn't execute consistently. This left a pretty big hole that we didn't fill until sometime later. Make sure that you execute and have the test owner be involved in this entire process and their getting their feedback. Focusing on the right scope, taking a minimal viable product approach is great, but it doesn't buy you anything if there's no agreement on when tasks are done and or if quality is subpar. I think most people would agree that having a definition of done in Agile development is a good thing. We get agreement on when we can call tasks complete, and it serves as a statement of the team's commitment to quality. But it has some unique benefits in automation as well. Primarily, it helps stakeholders develop realistic expectations. That test automation is not just a tool installation, and that typically involves software development and needs to be treated that way. I have the definition of done that we use in our implementations on the next slide. This has evolved quite a bit since our first attempts at Agile, but learn from our mistakes. When we first started, we were very much focused on velocity, which is probably typical of teams new to Agile. But we maybe took our eye off the ball a bit in terms of quality. Whatever velocity we had was really artificial because we were creating a lot of technical debt that had to be paid back later in the project. So this is more for your reference. I'm not going to go through each item, but here's what our current definition of done looks like for both tasks and the sprint itself. We often get comments that it seems a bit too much for quote-unquote just test automation. And there seems to be some surprise that we do code reviews and have smoke tests for both the code in the framework and the test suite. I will say we are a little bit loose with the term code review. The thoroughness of the review will vary depending on the task and the engineer, but some type of review is almost always performed. And the smoke tests are very important. We don't want the user to be the one that finds issue with the solution and potentially damage support for automation. We found that just having a smoke test for the framework and the test suite itself significantly reduces those types of issues and rework in later sprints. So, and feel free to use this as an example or for your own definition of done. Just one last point. I get a lot of questions on the two different types of components that I have listed here, so I'll kind of head them off at the pass. When we build frameworks, we take a layered approach. The core layer handles everything the framework needs to do independent of the application we're testing. So we can use that as a basis for each new implementation. The testing component layer performs the testing actions against the application under test. Because each layer has a different job, we have some varying done criteria. This slide really isn't specific to Agile test automation implementations, but I wanted to include it since I refer to it in the definition of done, and I get a lot of questions about what should be involved in testing the test suite. And it did come about as our definition of done evolved. We wanted to eliminate rework and latent defects, which we had seen increasing as more testers began to use the framework. So we have two types of test harnesses that we use. We refer to them as smoke tests, since we were getting a lot of questions around why we regression test our regression test. The core test harness just tests the core framework, everything that's independent of the application under test, and I've got some of those activities listed there. The test suite harness itself is essentially an execution of each of the existing test components to ensure that they still work. In some cases, where possible, we run the test suite test harness in upstream environments as a way to proactively identify impact of application changes that are coming downstream. Sprint review. certainly nothing that's shockingly new to anyone that's been involved with Agile, but for automation projects, we use it to get the stakeholders involved. We want these questions to be answered. Can the testers use the framework to effectively and efficiently create automated tests? Do the leads and managers, test leads and managers, get the information they need from the execution reports? And are we heading in the right direction with what we've delivered? Is the scope still aligned with the testing objectives and the business objectives? By getting the users involved, it ensures that they're ready to use the solution and deliver value, and it gives them additional confidence as they accept the features that are being built. And of course, it gives the automation team the feedback they need as they head into the next sprint planning session. Be diligent about your definition of done. Whatever your criteria are, they were included for a reason. Don't let things slide by because they are close enough. If you do this, you're just postponing potential disagreements that aren't going to get any better or less expensive to address over time. Finally, we found that taking the feedback from stakeholders and holding your own team retrospective serves as an important catalyst for continuous improvement. It's easy to say we'll do this better next time after sprint review, but without that retrospective, that internal team discussion, we've seen that it rarely happens. The retrospective gives you time to digest the feedback, internalize it, and come up with a realistic way to get better, and not just, hey, we'll do it better next time. So, getting near the end here, I want to talk a little bit about some Agile principles. So if you're involved in Agile, you're probably familiar with the Agile Manifesto, published back in 2001 by a group of thought leaders looking for alternatives to heavyweight software development processes that were very much document-driven. There's 12 principles behind the Agile Manifesto. I've cherry-picked 7 of them and given them a little bit of an automation spin. So the first one that I've picked is satisfy the customers through early and continuous delivery of value. From an automation perspective, what that means to me is that test automation must serve the organization. Automation for the sake of automation is a complete waste of time. And the Agile principles we're talking about, getting people involved, helps ensure that you're serving the organization. Next, welcome changing requirements. And from automation, I guess, from any type of development, that means be ready to accommodate changing test objectives and proactively understand the impact of application changes. Deliver working software frequently. From an automation perspective, for me, this means avoid the big bang approach. Allow the organization to use the solution to automate test activities from the beginning. Next, business people and developers working together daily. Again, this is related to the big bang approach. You don't want to implement test automation in a vacuum, separate from the organization it serves. Again, get everyone involved, get the stakeholders involved, and make decisions together. Next, build projects around motivated individuals and give them the environment, support, and trust they need to get the job done. From automation, that means have realistic expectations around what test automation is and, of course, what it isn't, and then trust the automation team to build the right solution based on the requirements that you give them. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Absolutely true for automation. Don't cut corners. And I've got an example of record and playback. Hopefully, we've moved beyond that as a viable automation solution. But the reality is, don't create technical debt just to get a certain velocity. Do it right, and in the end, it'll be a much better solution. Finally, simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work done, amount of work not done, is essential. From an automation perspective, don't set scope by focusing on automating manual test cases. Focus on testing activities that can benefit the most from automation. All right, so to wrap up, I told you I wasn't going to get on my automation soapbox, but I will a little bit. I wanted to end with one miscellaneous topic, and that's how Agile Automation integrates with Agile development. We found that integrating the automation function for integration and system-level testing in with the development sprints is not a good thing, meaning the expectation that whatever was developed during that sprint for the application will be part of the automated test suite at the end of the sprint. Is it possible? Sure, but a lot of things have to line up for that to happen. We found that it's better to separate out the two cycles and have the development sprints generate requirements for the automation sprint. It's then much more realistic to target the end of the next sprint, N+1 or maybe even N+2, depending on the situation, for those new automation features to be implemented. And finally, if you do have both an Agile approach to your automation development and your application development, we found that things operate much more smoothly if the automation sprints are offset from the development sprints. So in other words, if the development sprint starts on a Monday, automation sprints possibly start out on a Wednesday or Thursday. This eliminates a double set of planning and review meetings for those that need to be involved in both, and also provides a buffer for the development sprint backlog to be translated into requirements for the automation backlog. All right, so thank you again for your time today. We have a little time, 5-10 minutes or so, to discuss some questions, and I've got I'll address a few of them here, and then I'll get back to everyone individually via email. We can also have a phone discussion if you prefer after the webinar. All right. First off, and this is good because I think we experienced a lot of this when we first got started. How do you switch methodologies from waterfall to Agile when you're in a busy environment? Well, we went cold turkey. We had one implementation that was waterfall, and the next project we started was Agile, and we certainly had some pain points because we were learning as we went. It was a bit easier for us because we're essentially a separate automation team, and a lot of organizations we work with also have their automation teams separate from individual project teams. And it's easier because they're not directly integrated with that project team. So as long as that team is still serving the organization, the change is somewhat transparent to the internal customers they serve. Of course, you can't ignore that the project team will have increased involvement in that automation effort if you're doing the things that we just talked about. So they need to be aware of that impact, and you need to hold them to being involved. But of course, that's one of the benefits we're trying to achieve in the first place. So let me grab another one here. So the question is, when do you implement the feedback from the retrospective? In general, we implement it as soon as we can. Obviously, you need to think about the team's ability to absorb change, but if you went through the trouble of having a retrospective and identifying improvements, you want to take advantage of that. So like anything else, you prioritize those items, and you balance that against the reality of the workload and the team's ability to absorb that impact. The common items that we see in the retrospective is that we don't hold ourselves to the definition of done, right? So even though I said you need to do that, that's one of the things that often gets put by the wayside. And we don't push back hard enough on the project stakeholders when they are too busy to be involved. Of course, everyone is busy, and having another set of responsibilities on top of what they're already doing is not easy. To address that, we do our best to state the realities up front and get their commitment to it. You understand that in the end, they're going to own this, and their involvement is only going to result in a better solution. Next question. Does my development team need to use Agile too? So I think that last slide probably prompted that question. No, the development cycle doesn't have to be Agile to use an Agile process to implement automation. The automation backlog is built from the testing requirements of the system under test. So the type of development cycle really doesn't matter as long as you have that role in place that can evaluate those requirements and turn them into automation backlog items appropriately. I think what we found when the development team is Agile, they understand those processes. We sometimes will alter our processes to be more like the process of the development team because they're familiar with that. So just the familiarity and the regular cadence of the stand-ups that they're already used to, and other aspects of Agile, I think it helps. But we've done probably just as many implementations where the development process was not Agile as we have where it when it is. And again, there's probably a little bit more that needs to happen up front in terms of education of what it means to be involved in the Agile implementation, what the drain is going to be on those resources, but if you do a good job of explaining the benefits, we found that it typically is not an issue. I think we have time for a couple more quick ones. So this one really isn't, a little bit off topic or not related to Agile, but do I have to have my own test automation environment or my own automation test environment to be successful? So again, a little bit off topic from Agile, but I think anytime you can dedicate an environment to test automation, that's a good thing. It allows you to have much better control of the environment and test data and potentially eliminate those failures, those execution failures that are related to environment and data issues. So do you have to? No. Is it realistic? And a lot of organizations' environments are expensive, they're complex, and having another environment is difficult. For organizations that are more experienced with more of a DevOps type scenario, and they're already spinning up environments and tearing them down on demand, that tends to become less of an issue. But in more traditional environments where there's one environment, test environment, it's like production, and data is only refreshed once or twice a year, dedicating an environment to automation just for automated execution is much more difficult. All right, so we're up against the time here. So I will address all other questions in the next should be the next 24 hours via email, and if I don't do a good enough job in my email reply, please reach out, and we can always set up a discussion if you wanted to dig deeper. So thank you again, everyone, for taking time out of your day today. Hope it was informative and educational. If there's any additional questions or any further discussion outside of this, please feel free to reach out to me. Got my information there up on the slide. Email is probably always the best. And again, I thank you and have a great rest of the week.